Hello, students. We discussed the plot, and the plot that we arrived at is the letter from Jane arrived to to Miss Elizabeth when Mr. Darcy, Bingley, and Elizabeth were in Mr. Gardiner's Derbyshire, where Pemberley is very much near closer to Derbyshire, where Mr. Darcy owns a property, large estate. Everything that surprised her created a respect for Mr. Darcy. The housekeeper's praise suddenly encouraged the love relations, but she is not going to express right now. She is not even disclosing her love with Mr. Darcy. So, the later totally dismayed Elizabeth. She immediately rushes to her uncle, Mr. Gardiner. He is wanted in London, where Mr. Bennet had already left, where he is trying to find them out, Lydia and Mr. Wickham, because he has brought a disrepute to the Bennet family. And Elizabeth begins to cry. She tells Darcy what has happened. He expresses the concern. It worried him. It worried his own silence. Wickham is responsible for this present situation, and that is what. Now, Darcy immediately left Longbourn. For Longbourn, Elizabeth. Elizabeth realizes she loves him too. Elizabeth and Gardiner rush back to Longbourn day and night. After Lydia's elopement, लिडिया पळून गेल्यानंतर गार्डिनर आणि एलिझाबेथ हे लॉंगबॉर्नला वापस येतात. Mr. Darcy, without leaving any word, rushed to London. Darcy know what is there, so he rushed back to London to trust these two lovers, Wickham and Lydia. Gardiners are hopeful that they have married. Elizabeth doubts, because Wickham's nature is definitely a thing to worry, because he who has no money, and Lydia is a kind of a foolish type of a daughter. When they reach Longbourn, they find that Jane is running the household. Mr. Bennet has gone to London. Mrs. Bennet is indisposed to her room with hysterics. Kitty and Mary, they are absorbed in their own thoughts. The family's distress continues to increase. Mr. Bennet has written not a news. What happened? Are they able to find them out, Lydia and Wickham in London? But there is no trust. Mr. Gardiner, who tried to accompany Mr. Bennet in London, but Mr. Gardiner could not find. Mr. Bennet returns home, and Mr. Gardiner is to manage the situation in London. Mr. Bennet admits that she was right away, warning him not to let Lydia to go to Brighton, because this repute may not have arrived by then. Meanwhile, the whole town gossips about the Wickham's treachery, disreputable nature, and speculates on Lydia's future. The letter arrives from Mr. Collins, condemning Lydia's behavior, advising Bennet's to disown her in order to save the rest of the family's reputation. It is not going to happen. Mr. Collins, who blamed that he's happy not to get married with the Bennet family because Lydia has brought a disrepute to the family. Relief comes with a letter from Mr. Gardiner that Lydia and Wickham have been found, but they are still not married yet. They have been convinced to do so, provided Wickham's debts are paid. There are conditions laid by Wickham. विकॅमने लग्न करण्यासाठी कंडिशन्स ठेवलेल्या होत्या. लिडियाशी त्याने लग्न केलेलं नव्हतं अजून. मिस्टर बिनेट जे आहेत ते ॲग्री होतात का काय त्याला हवं आहे ते मी देण्यासाठी तयार. मिस्टर गार्डिनर ते स्वतःहून काही पैसे जे आहेत ते विकहॅमला देण्यासाठी सोबत ठेवलेले असतात. त्याला मिस्टर बेनेट यांना हे आवडत नाही. The idea of being indebted to his brother-in-law. Lydia is going to get married to Mrs. Bennet's mood immediately shifts from hysterics to hysterical giddiness. Forgetting about the shameful circumstances under the marriage will take place, she began to calculate that Lydia will need new wedding clothes, planning personally to spread the good news to the neighbors that Lydia is going to get married to Wickham. Her only task in her life is to get her daughters married. And when Mr. Gardiner writes Wickham has the officer's commission in the north of England, Mrs. Bennet alone regrets that couple will be living so far away. Contemplating about her sister's marriage, Elizabeth reflects that her wishes for a future with Darcy are completely hopeless now. If he would marry into a family as embarrassing as Bennet's, he would never be going to marry the family. Wickham is bad. म्हणून ह्या सगळे विचार तिच्या मनामध्ये येत असतात. सॅडनेस तिला असतो. लिडिया काही सगळी बुटी पे केल्यानंतर सगळी अमाऊंट विकॅमला पे केली, गार्डिनरने पे केली, मिस्टर बिनेट यांनी पे केली. ती दिल्यानंतर लिडिया आणि विकहॅम दोघं लग्न करून वापस येतात. वापस आल्यानंतर एलिझाबेथ आणि जेन हे कन्फ्यूज होतात. मिस्टर बिनेट्स त्या ठिकाणी बोलत असतात. पण ही जी कपल घरी आलेला आहे ते सेल्फ ॲश्युअर्ड असतं. निर्लज्ज स्वरूपामध्ये ते दोघंही त्या ठिकाणी ह्या घरामध्ये वावरतात. एलिझाबेथ त्या लिडियाशी बोलत असतात. एलिझाबेथ सांगते का लिडिया ही त्या विकॅमच्या प्रेमामध्ये अटकून गेलेली आहे आणि विकहॅम ही इज विथ हर. विकहॅम fled Brighton because of gambling debts, taking Lydia along because she was willing. Unimpressed by the Wickham's still charming manners, Elizabeth politely informs him that she is aware of the past but wants to wish amicable relationship with him. One morning, Lydia mentions that Darcy was present at her wedding. Intensely curious about Darcy's involvement in her sister's marriage, Elizabeth writes to her aunt to demand more information. Mrs. Gardiner quickly replied, explained it to Darcy. Mr. Gardiner, who found Lydia and Wickham, he persuaded Wickham to marry Lydia with a substantial wedding settlement. Darcy paid all the Wickham's debt. दासीने जी अमाऊंट होती ती पूर्ण त्या ठिकाणी पे केलेली होती. सगळं डेप्ट त्याचे घेतलेलं कर्ज, सगळी डिमांड, घेतलेलं कर्ज हे डासीने पे केलेलं होतं. आर्मीचं कमिशन हे त्याने पे केलेलं होतं. मिस्टर गार्डिनर implies that Darcy was motivated not by a sense of responsibility but a sense of love for Elizabeth. हे त्या ठिकाणी जाणवतं. मिसेस गार्डिनरशी बोलत असताना एलिझाबेथला हे समजतंय, सी डार्सी इज अ लव्हिंग पर्सन ना. तिच्या मनामध्ये डार्सीविषयी त्या ठिकाणी मान सन्मान रिस्पेक्ट यायला लागलेला आहे. मिसेस बिनेट ती लॅमेंट करते का आता ती खूप दूर राहायला जाणार आहे डार्सीच्या सोबत. बिंगली is returning to Netherfield Hall. Shifts her attention to Jane. Jane claims to be unaffected by Bingley's arrival. Elizabeth is certain that her married sister has still feelings for him. When Bingley visits Longbourn, Elizabeth is surprised and excited to see that Darcy has accompanied him. दोघे त्या ठिकाणी लॉंगबॉर्नला येतात. Bingley is engrossed in Jane. He is more and more reserved with her heart, making Elizabeth uncomfortable in her mother's rude treatment of Darcy. She reflects how much Darcy has secretly helped Bennet family. Darcy goes back to London. Bingley continues to visit Bennet family. Jane and Mr. Bingley now getting closer and closer, and much to everyone's delight, he finally proposed Jane about marriage. Lady Catherine, the aristocratic lady, unexpectedly dropped in the Longbourn and wanted to talk to Elizabeth. She heard that Elizabeth and Darcy are now to be engaged, and she is there to stop them any romance that may exist between Darcy and Elizabeth. दोघांना एकमेकांपासून दूर ठेवण्यासाठी. आणि ती त्या ठिकाणी सांगते का डार्सी आणि मिस डी बरो यांचं लहानपणी जन्मापासूनच दोघंही एकमेकांशी लग्न करणार असं ठरलेलं आहे. लेडी कॅथरीन ही एलिझाबेथला त्या ठिकाणी सांगते तिच्या आल्यामुळे तू इन्फेरियर बर्थ आहे, नो प्लेस इन द वर्ल्ड आहे, अशा पद्धतीने तिला बोलून त्या ठिकाणी ते लग्न, तो रोमांस, त्यांचं लव्ह रिलेशन दूर करण्यासाठी प्रयत्न करत असते लेडी कॅथरीन डी ब्राउ. पण लेडी कॅथरीनची डिमांड आहे का तू त्या डार्सीच्या सोबत राहायचं नाही, त्याच्यासोबत जायचं नाही, त्याच्यावर प्रेम दाखवायचं नाही. बट सी रेफ्युज्ड आउटराइट. ती ॲक्सेप्ट पण करत नाही, तो प्रपोजल ॲक्सेप्ट करत नाही. लेडी कॅथरीन तिथून रागाने निघून जाते आणि डार्सीशी बोलणार या संदर्भात बोलत असते. बघा त्या आणशी डार्सी काय प्रत्युत्तर करेल. She tries to know. She will not submit her love. बघा ती आपलं प्रेम पण विकहॅम आपलं डार्सी आणि लेडी कॅथरीन दोघांनाही दाखवत नसते. Several days later, एलिझाबेथचे एक्सपेक्टेशन्स असतात डार्सी लॉंगबॉर्नला वापस येतो बिंगलीच्या सोबत आणि ते दोघंही एकमेकांच्या सोबत राहतात. एलिझाबेथ म्हणते का लिडियाच्या आणि विकहॅमच्या मॅरेजमध्ये डार्सीनी केलेली खूप मोठी मदत होती. त्या फॅमिलीला डिसरेप्यूट काळीमा लागण्यापासून डार्सीने वाचवलेलं होतं. डार्सी इतका मोठ्या समाजातला असतानाही त्याने अशा एलिझाबेथ ह्या मुलीशी लग्न करत आहे. आणि त्याच वेळेस डार्सी एलिझाबेथला सांगतं का तू जे मला सांगितलं, ज्या रागाने मला बोलली होतीस, त्यामुळे मला थोडासा विचार हा माझ्या स्वभावाच्या संदर्भात, प्रेजुडायसेसच्या संदर्भात, प्राईड अँड प्रेजुडायसेसच्या संदर्भात मला करावा लागला आणि त्यामुळे मला तो बदल माझ्या स्वभावामध्ये घडवून आणता आला. दोघंही बिंगले आणि जेन यांच्या संदर्भात चर्चा करतात. Darcy is happy about the engagement. He admits to encouraging Bingley to propose. Darcy आणि एलिझाबेथची एंगेजमेंट त्या ठिकाणी झालेली पाहायला मिळते. Bennet family has difficulty believing it at first. Elizabeth's criticism of Darcy were initially so strong. No one except Gardiners had any idea of change in her feelings for him. After the family is convinced, everyone's reactions are characteristic. Jane is genuinely happy for her sister. Mrs. Bennet is thrilled at the prospect of the Darcy's wealth. Mr. Bennet is saddened that his favorite daughter will be living after Elizabeth's marriage with Mr. Darcy. Now, Mrs. Bennet is extremely happy because her three daughters are going to get married. Lydia is already married, Elizabeth is going to marry, and Jane is also going to marry with Mr. Bingley. After the marriages of Elizabeth, Darcy, Jane, and Bingley, life progresses happily for the newlywed couple. Bingley's moved closer to Pemberley about a year. Elizabeth and Jane are frequently visiting their sister Kitty, who improves considerably under their influence. Back in Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet continues to be living as her usual. Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Elizabeth, enjoys visiting her. Mary appreciates having no pretty sister at home to compete with. As for the rest of their families, Lydia and Wickham continue to squander money. Lady Catherine is cold to Elizabeth, and Miss Darcy and Elizabeth become very close. Darcy and Elizabeth's happiness is increased by their visits from Gardiner. Gardiner ही तसं आणि डार्सी आणि एलिझाबेथ दोघंही त्या ठिकाणी गार्डिनर्स यांनी दोघांना एकत्र आणण्यासाठी खूप मोठी भूमिका केली. That is very much important in this part of the novel. So like this, three and the hero and the heroine are brought together under the romantic spell of Darcy and Elizabeth, Jane and Bingley. Both couples are living happily thereafter. So this is the story of the Pride and Prejudice. The plot of the novel comes to an end, so we just need to think about this plot. Okay, this story is, to the modern readers, is very exciting. It is all about marriage, the parental responsibility, the responsibility of a genuine girl, like in the form of Elizabeth, young women of Austen's day did not have these advantages, but the class consciousness is always playing the role at that particular time in the 19th century. Women in the early 19th century were not allowed in higher education, so there were private tutors and governors and were arranged. Private schools were extent of education to some extent open to them. Elizabeth is living liquidity, lively, and able to further her education. Elizabeth indicates much to Lady Catherine about her education. Her sisters, unstructured but accessible, we were always encouraged to read, had all the masters that were necessary. Those whose clothes to be idle certainly might. So these are the accomplishments of this beautiful novel and beautiful topic that this story is written about, and that is the popular theme yet we find even today, and that is what we have seen over 200 years. This novel is being read and studied across the universities and colleges in the English department all over the world. And that is the popularity of this novel and this beautiful author in the form of Pride and Prejudice. And unexpectedly, this is the first novel by Jane Austen. So, with this, we come to an end of this novel. Critical discussion will follow in the next video lecture. Thank you.